was driving around Dallas the other day, and as I was leaving my house, I recognized that there's this wall that's falling over in the back of a neighbor's yard. And it's falling apart, and there's construction or caution tape around it trying to signify like, hey, don't come over here, you might get hurt. And it got me thinking about how these walls that we build for protection end up causing damage to ourselves. There's walls that we build around each other. There's walls that we build around our hearts. There's walls that we build between us. And it's for many different reasons. Sometimes it's for protection, of course. Sometimes it's because somebody's different than us. But this idea of separating from others isn't something that's foreign to the church. There's been an understanding that sanctification and the way that we obtain that holiness that God desires for us to be holy as God is holy, meant that we had to separate ourselves from the world around us. We had to distance ourselves so that we do not get dirty from those around us, that we do not fall into temptation because of being around people. And it pretty much stems from a theology that says that in order for us to be holy, as God is holy, we have to be completely other. We have to be separate. And if we follow that through, it leads to an understanding and a theology that the divine, the ideal, the perfect, is somehow separate from the real, the tangible, and the tactile. That set apart and to be holy meant separation from our humanity, separation from what makes us human, even our flesh. This sets up a system of understanding that the other, God, is outside of anything we can touch and feel and taste. But then there came this Jesus. And tonight we celebrate his birth. Because what happens in Jesus is it breaks some of those barriers. It breaks down the structures and the foundations that we've had around our religion, around our faith, around theology. Because we know what to do with Jesus' divinity. Man, he's God. And we know what to do with that. We know that he is God and he is sinless and he is performing miracles and he is conquering death. Like, we know the story. We know about Jesus' divinity, but we often struggle with connecting to Jesus' humanity. In the Gospel of John, he begins by retelling the creation story. He goes back to the very beginning and says, in the beginning was the Word. Now that word in Greek that we translate as word is the Greek word logos, which was really a philosophical idea found from the Greeks that was getting at the idea of the ideal, the perfect, that there was some idea that was beyond all other ideas, some thought that was beyond all other thoughts. And that was the goal, was to reach that ideal. So what John is doing is he's hijacking this word that was used in their culture to say, I'll tell you about this logos. This word was in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. It was with God in the beginning, and everything that was made through this Word. And then we come to verse 14, and this is where everything gets shattered apart. The Word became flesh. So what John is doing is he's taking this logos, this infinite, this being that was from the beginning, this everything that was made through this word, and he puts it in the story and says, this is now flesh. This idea was no longer far off, but this idea, this word, this thing, this infinite being, this ideal philosophy, this everything became finite, became tactile, became touchable. This means for us very simply that God is not far off, that he is near. And somehow we have to reconcile that with our understanding of holiness, because if set apart means that we're apart from humanity, well, that's being broken up here. Because when God is holy, his holiness draws him towards humanity. So set apart cannot be separated. It must mean some sort of integrated. Our flesh, in some way, is now made holy. And if our spirituality and our faith is not grounded in our flesh, in our humanity, then we can't call it Christian. It's something else entirely. If our spirituality, if the way that we see the world is not grounded in our flesh, in lived in-ness, in our humanity, then we can't call it Christian, because Christ became flesh. Now we see a lot of this separation. We see a lot of this misunderstanding in the American church. Somehow spirituality became something that we separate ourselves from real people, and we divide, and even some of our church buildings look more like fortresses than they do like homes. We get on our soapboxes and we want to argue and yell about our theology that just is trying to call out the otherness of humanity, the badness of humanity, and leave your humanity behind in order to follow Jesus. But it doesn't take into consideration what it means for real people in a real world, because it leaves the flesh out of it. It leaves the humanness, the humanity out of it. It's like we have to separate ourselves from ourselves to follow God. But the Word became flesh. And in that, it's the beginning of the redemption of all creation. Because John is not making a mistake, or John is not just haphazardly choosing to retell the creation story. His entire gospel is doing this from start to finish. It's saying Jesus is the new creation. It's the beginning of making all things right. And if you remember, in the beginning, God did not make humanity and go, it's all right. It's fine. No. God made humanity. He made flesh, and he said, this is good. So we must be that thing that Jesus became. We must be the holy humanity. Christmas Eve means that God is not somewhere else looking down on us, but that God is here now. Our spirituality and holiness is not found by separating ourselves spiritually and physically, but recognizing that we are holy when we embrace our whole selves, the flesh and the spirit. Faith must have flesh on it. John is calling us back to the story of creation. God took a pile of mud and he breathed in it. And he said, this is very good. And he wants to breathe in us again. Our humanity is holy. We just have to have the eyes to see it. We have to have the eyes to recognize that the infinite is also finite. That the holy is found in the common. So may you this Christmas Eve recognize that while this world may have built walls to keep you out, God has broken those down. While even our religion at times has said that who you are is bad, our God says you are good.